What if the most fundamental event of your life, the very act of being born, wasn't a gift, but a catastrophe? I know, it's a really unsettling thought, but it forces us to question the very foundations of the reality we all just accept. So let's dive into this because this one idea is the perfect starting point for understanding how entire worldviews and the realities they create can actually be engineered from the ground up.
This is the bleak but kind of poetic worldview of the Romanian philosopher Emil Cioran. His style was really unique. He wasn't about building these huge, complex philosophical systems. Instead, his writing is full of these short, sharp lines, like polished shards of despair. For Cioran, just existing was an imposition. He saw birth not as this miracle, but as the first trauma that we spend our entire lives trying to run away from. It's a truly radical and, deeply pessimistic take on what it even means to be alive.
And right here, this is where we see a profound collision of ideas. Two worlds just smashing into each other. On one side, you have Cioran's philosophy, which basically argues that the ultimate crime you can commit is bringing another life into this world. And on the other side, you've got the vision at the very heart of Project 2025, which sees restoring the traditional family, a structure built for having kids, as absolutely essential to national salvation. One sees birth as a cosmic mistake, the other a moral and civic duty. Okay, so let's unpack that second idea a little more. Because Project 2025, well, it isn't just another political platform. It's a detailed, step-by-step schematic for engineering a very specific version of reality.
And what's really striking is just the sheer scale of the ambition here. This isn't about small policy changes. No, we are talking about a comprehensive, top-to-bottom overhaul of the entire federal government. And it's all designed with one singular ideological goal in mind.
So how's it supposed to work?
Well, the plan is basically a three-act play. First, it starts by dismantling what's called the administrative state, replacing career civil servants with thousands of political loyalists. Then, with the whole machinery of government under control, the next step is to consolidate all that power directly in the presidency. And finally, with all that power centralized, the goal is to use that authority to roll out a very specific social vision. It's a methodical, step-by-step plan for total systemic change. But here's the thing. Political power is only half the battle. For a change this massive to actually stick, you have to change what people believe is real. And that requires a much deeper kind of engineering, one that uses some pretty powerful and often invisible tools.
This is the crucial question, isn't it? Because our reality, especially our social reality, it's not nearly as fixed as we like to think it is. It's a system that's built on agreement, and that agreement can be influenced. So what are the tools you'd use for that kind of job?
The first tool is cybernetics. Now I know, that sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, but it's actually a very practical science of control. Just think of it like creating an information nervous system for a whole society. The goal is to steer this really complex system, like a government, toward exactly where you want it to go by managing the flow of information. So a plan to install thousands of loyalists isn't just a power grab. It's a cybernetic move to control the feedback loops of the state itself. Next up, we've got engineered consent. This is the psychological part of the equation. It was pioneered by a guy named Edward Bernays, and it's basically the art of manufacturing agreement. See, it's not about convincing people with logic. It's about tapping into their hidden, unconscious desires to make them want the thing you're selling. If you want to implement a biblically grounded vision, you first have to make people crave the security and order that vision promises them.
And then there's maybe the strangest, but also the most powerful tool of all, hyperstition. Think of these as fictions that literally make themselves true. They're ideas that are so potent that the very act of believing in them and acting on that belief causes them to collapse into reality. A hyperstition isn't just a story, it's a reality-generating engine. And its fuel is belief.
So here's the crucial point. When you combine these three things, you have an incredibly powerful toolkit for changing society. Right? Cybernetics gives you the structure for control, engineered consent gives you the psychological leverage to get people on board, and hyperstition, well, that gives you the reality-bending power to make a fictional threat or a promised utopia feel absolutely real. But for this whole toolkit to work on a massive scale, people have to be receptive. And this leads us to a fascinating and honestly a kind of disturbing psychological phenomenon that explains how entire populations can adopt a new shared reality, even one that seems completely disconnected from the facts. It's called folie à deux, which is French for a madness of two. It started as a clinical term for a delusion that's shared between two people, but psychologists found that it can scale up. It can become a folie à plusieurs, a madness of many. It's this process where a really potent delusional belief gets transmitted from one source and then becomes a shared, unshakable reality for an entire group. And this process, it usually unfolds in a few stages. It kicks off with a tidy myth, a simple but really compelling story about some kind of existential threat. Once that myth takes hold, the group starts to see everything through that lens, projecting all their fears onto the world. And that creates the final stage, a self-sealing bubble, where any fact that contradicts the shared story is just dismissed as fake news or even as part of the threat itself.
The psychologist Carl Jung saw this danger crystal clear. He warned that when these collective delusions really take hold, the entire psychological framework of a society can just break down. The state itself stops acting rationally and becomes, in his words, something more like a lunatic asylum, operating on its own internal logic that's totally detached from the real world.
So why are these delusions so incredibly powerful? Well, it's because they don't operate on the level of logic. They tap into something much deeper, what Jung called archetypes, these universal patterns in our unconscious mind. You know, the hero, the shadow, the apocalypse. When a story hits those archetypal notes, it just bypasses our rational brain. It doesn't just feel true, it feels righteous, morally necessary. And it builds this psychological fortress that facts just can't get through.
And this is where it gets really dangerous. This collective delusional archetype, it acts almost like a living thing, like an entity worming its way out of the collective unconscious. It feeds on our suppressed desires, our desire for order, for meaning, for salvation, and it harnesses all that raw energy. And then it uses that energy to reshape the world, through language, through control, through illusion, and crucially, through the reality-bending power of hyperstition.
Which brings us right back to where we started. From Schwaron's total rejection of reality's most basic premise to Project 2025's detailed blueprint to engineer a completely new one, what we see is that the thing we call reality is far more flexible than we imagine. So the real question isn't just whether the code can be rewritten, it's what happens to all of us when it is.